Back everyone to our fifth conversation in this series that we've been holding with Justice for Soli, and really looking at the prison system and COVID-19 and various aspects of the prison system. For those of you who have not joined us before, my name is Emily Coyle. I'm the Executive Director of the Canadian Association of Elizabeth Fry Societies. We work with and on behalf of criminalized women and girls, and we are a prison abolition organization. We believe that prisons do not repair the harm that they set out to repair, and that we should be investing in communities and not prisons. This week is Elizabeth Fry Week, so I definitely have to mention that at the outset. Every year in the week leading up to Mother's Day, we have Elizabeth Fry Week. We mark that in order to remind people of the humanity of the women who are in the prison system, many of whom are mothers and for whom incarceration has negative ripple effects on their family in particular and on their children. I'm so very excited to be welcoming our guest today, but I'm going to leave it to Yusuf to introduce her. It is such an honor to have you here, Pam. And before I leave you all, I wanted to acknowledge, as we have in the past, that all of the prisons in Canada are built on stolen land. Mm-hmm. So over to you, Yusuf.
Hello, everybody. My name is Yusuf Fikiri. Welcome to our fifth session. I'm the founder of the Justice For Soli movement, the movement that was the catalyst after the tragic death of Suleiman Fikiri at the hands of 12 guards at the Central East Correctional Center. Bonsoir, mesdames et messieurs, à notre cinquième session. Notre prochain invité a besoin sans introduction. Elle est une super connaissance par rapport de droit, par rapport de plusieurs choses. Et on est vraiment chanceux ce soir pour parler à le sujet qui affecterait des femmes dans la prison, particulièrement des femmes, des autochtones dans la prison canadienne. Our guest is Dr. Pam Palmater, lawyer, professor, author, and social justice activist from Eel River Bar First Nation, New Brunswick. She has 4 university degrees, including a BA from St. Thomas in Native Studies and LLB from University of New Brunswick, and her master's in doctorate in law from Dalhousie University, specializing in Indigenous law. She currently holds the position of full professor and chair in Indigenous governance at Ryerson University. A practicing lawyer for 20 years, Pam has been volunteering and working in First Nation issues for well over 25 years. She's the author of 2 books, Indigenous Nationhood, Empowering Grassroots Citizens, and Beyond Blood, Rethinking Indigenous Identity. Pam was one of the spokespeople and public educators for the Idle No More movement and advocates along other movements focusing on social justice and human rights. She is frequently called as a legal expert before parliamentary and United Nations committees dealing with laws and policies impacting Indigenous people. Pam, we are honored, grateful, and humbled to have you speak with us this evening on a very important matter that affects individuals here in this country. And we're so grateful to learn from you this evening. So I'll get right into the first question. You have been leading the conversation in Canada around the gendered impact of COVID-19 on Indigenous women, including a critical focus on Indigenous women who are incarcerated. As we enter this conversation this evening, can you share the connections you flagged between Canada's historic and continued deaths against Indigenous people and how Indigenous women now face greater risks of infection and death due to the COVID-19 pandemic?
Well, thank you very much for having me. I'm on Scugog territory today, but I'm from the sovereign Mi'kmaq Nation and Eel River Bar First Nation. And I'm just really grateful to be part of this panel because despite the fact that we're in a pandemic, that doesn't mean human rights aren't at issue. And in fact, for our sisters inside, it's even more of an issue now. And it's really important that we all work together in solidarity to make sure that we put women's voices first, especially sisters on the inside, racialized peoples, Indigenous women, and make sure that we as prison justice activists and Indigenous rights activists and human rights activists are making sure that governments are held to account for the actions they take or don't take. And I think it's really appropriate that tonight we're having this conversation because just yesterday was May the 5th, which is a day that acknowledges all of the, you know, abused, traded, exploited, disappeared, and murdered Indigenous women and girls in this country. And the date is also significant this year because it's almost a year since the National Inquiry into Murdered or Missing Indigenous Women and Girls released its final report and found Canada guilty of historic and ongoing genocide. It's been almost a year and there's no substantive action to deal with any of the issues, one of which is the gross incarceration of Indigenous women and girls. And so Canada, before the pandemic, was already embroiled in its largest human rights crisis ever, the genocide of Indigenous women and girls. And we know they are the fastest growing prison population, yet they're the ones who have been most abused by Canada's, you know, colonially violent system. So, and this is very much tied to history. Like, your question is really, really important because people think that what's happened was in the past and you can just kind of move on from it. But the National Inquiry has showed us that no, genocide is actually ongoing. Yes, historically, they used smallpox blankets to speed up the deaths of Indigenous peoples. Yes, they were engaged in scalping bounties and forced sterilizations. But what's really important to understand is what happens today. There's still forced and coerced sterilizations today. There's still purposeful and chronic underfunding of social programs and services that leads to the premature deaths of Indigenous women and girls today. They are still very much targeted by government, state agencies, and society for horrific acts of exploitative violence. You think of the child porn industry, you think of human trafficking, you think of all of the murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls. So you have a situation where Indigenous women and girls in particular have been targeted by all levels of governments and states, including police officers, including corrections officers. So they're dealing with multiple levels of racism. And people say, well, you know, how does this link to today's incarceration? Well, think about it. More than a fifth of all Indigenous peoples in prison were impacted by the residential school system. 2/3 were impacted by the foster care system. Canada is literally institutionalizing Indigenous peoples and cranking out a system where they just transfer from one institution to another. You literally go from a group foster home to youth corrections to a local prison, you know, and on and on and on it goes. And so you have a very urgent crisis, especially in a pandemic, because what's happening here is that Native women experience a double whammy. So they have literally had to try to survive genocide, you know, historic and ongoing, but they also have to try to survive somehow. So imagine the double whammy of, number one, being targeted for assimilation and oppression and removal from our lands. And if you pass that hurdle, then you have to escape sexualized violence by society, government, and state actors. And if you survive that, then you have to try to navigate poverty, homelessness, domestic abuse, poor health. And if you manage to do all of that, then the law decides that if you don't navigate that minefield in a way which respects all of Canada's laws, which are specifically designed to oppress you and assimilate you or eliminate you, then you're going to end up in prison. So you're targeted from the outset for oppression, and then trying to navigate oppression, you end up in Canada's prison system and being even more oppressed. But the worst part about that is the legacy that it leaves, because once you incarcerate an Indigenous woman, what is it, 95% of those have children? Those children are now statistically more likely to end up as a murdered or missing Indigenous woman or girl, or end up incarcerated. I mean, they are literally institutionalizing our people into a vicious cycle that we can't get out of. And you literally cannot separate that kind of genocidal context for Indigenous women and girls from the current state of incarceration. Canada has literally put them there. When the Office of the Correctional Investigator has investigated this phenomena over the last couple of decades, they found over and over and over again, this isn't about increased levels of criminality. This lays at the feet of Canada's blatant individual and systemic discriminatory laws, policies, practices, and omissions. They're simply not getting the benefit of the basic human rights that other people have in this country. And if they did, there wouldn't be a single Indigenous woman in prison today. And so it's no wonder that they're overrepresented. And now, because of this pandemic, they are at the highest risk of getting, COVID-19 because they're in such squalid conditions, overcrowded, unsanitary. I don't have to tell CAEFS what it's about. And they already have vulnerable health systems because of this history of lack of access to health care and poor health. I mean, they've literally created a perfect storm, and despite their legal obligations to address it, they haven't come up with a really comprehensive decarceration plan. And I think we need to get these women out of prison.
Thank you so much, Pam, for that very emphatic, passionate response and important comment about this very important conversation that's continuing to go, but we must stop. I'm going to pass it on to Emily to go with our next question.
Yeah, I mean, it's clear what this crisis this pandemic has shown us glaringly are the gaps and the problems in our systems, which include the genocide of Indigenous people, in particular Indigenous women. And, so you've recognized the urgent need and called for the immediate reduction in Canada's prison population, as have we. And you've seen actually that probably out of the 6 federal institutions for women, 2 of them have had outbreaks of COVID-19. And, truly, there have been some, there's some now time, because the women who got it have mostly recovered. And so now we say to CSC, there's time for you to put in place a plan. Mm-hmm. You've been reacting for so long. You've been reacting for the last 6 weeks. We've been calling for the depopulation. Now you know what you have to do. Let's really put this in place. And so in your call for decarceration, you've noticed that any assessment of the risk level of prisoners to be released would have to be done in partnership with Indigenous communities and with Indigenous leaders. So I completely agree with you, and I would love for you to tell us more about why this is so critical.
Well, I mean, this question really gets at the root of the racism and sexism, the blatant and systemic that's inherent within Canada, Canadian corrections, all of their laws, policies, practices, and institutions. And it starts, it really starts with the over-incarceration. And, for anybody who's watching and doesn't know just the basic stats, Indigenous peoples are only 5% of the population. Half of that is Indigenous women, yet 30% of federal prisons are Indigenous peoples, which is the highest ever. I mean, that's been a massive increase over the last 20 years. But women, Indigenous women, are 42%. That's beyond comprehension that could be the case. But it's even worse at some provincial levels. I mean, you're getting 50, 60, 70, 80% of provincial jails, and people sitting on remand being Indigenous peoples, and our poor youth, 50% or more at any given time are Indigenous. And in places like Saskatchewan, one institution is 98% Indigenous girls. So this isn't a matter of criminality. This is so horribly racism. And it's not just that, because, we're leading up to this question on risk levels, but throughout the whole system, they're more likely to be arrested in the first place, have a higher number of charges, higher level of charges, longer sentences, less parole, less access to programs, because more of them are in solitary confinement or whatever they're calling it these days, and assessed at higher risk levels. And here's the zinger, again, another double whammy. They're assessed at higher risk levels, in part because of Gladue reports, which were intended to keep Native people out of prison. But instead, once you get into corrections, you know, corrections officials look at this and say, oh, you've had all these problems. Well, you're going to be a problem for us. We're going to put you in maximum security. So their own experience trying to navigate genocide and all of their trauma and all of the horrific violence that they've experienced will now be used against them to disadvantage them. And so that's the number one reason why I say it cannot be corrections alone that determines the risk level. Because I agree, you know, they should have instantly released people who were low risk with supports, of course, but when you really dig into it, how many Indigenous women are going to be in the low risk category because of this discrimination? And do we want to advocate for something that will triply discriminate against them? And so that's why everything that we say and advocate has to come with the proviso that there's got to be some kind of human rights oversight through all of these pandemic measures across Canada for everything, but especially for prisons, because we know the guards are not going to come to the table and be open, or corrections administrators going to be open about, you know, how they decide who's low risk and who isn't if they've already deemed someone to be medium or maximum security or have thrown them in solitary confinement. I mean, the union officials already come out in the media saying, oh, we can't add to the pandemic by releasing all of these dangerous people. I mean, really irresponsible statements that don't reflect the situation, especially for Indigenous women who are in prison. And so, in addition to being less likely to be categorized as low risk, and within institutions that now we've already seen outbreaks, the situation is critical. They already should have did this. They knew before Christmas that a pandemic was possible. Even without a pandemic being possible, these kinds of emergency measures should already have been in place, one, to address the human rights violation of the gross overrepresentation, these people shouldn't have been in prison anyway, and two, for any kind of national crisis or disaster. There could be flooding, there could be, you know, power outages, there could be wars. I mean, literally anything could happen. And you mean to tell me this country never thought for a minute, what do we do with all of these prisoners in prison? And you know, so this unfortunately puts that burden on our shoulders, because our sisters inside, they don't get a voice. It's certainly not a voice that's listened to, and it's up to us to make sure that that voice comes through. And I'm sure they are absolutely terrified about getting COVID, because it's not just about recovering from COVID. Many people who so-called recover from COVID will now have lifelong impacts from having had COVID, especially if they manage to survive a ventilator. There's already lots of health evidence here saying that they could have ongoing health impacts. They're not condemned to that. That's not part of their prison sentence. We have every legal obligation to prevent anything happening to them while they're in prison. The Canadian government has that legal responsibility. So we really have to look at what it means, a decarceration plan, to make sure that Indigenous women do not get excluded from any decarceration plan they do come up with, because they've already decided to categorize them at such a high level that they wouldn't qualify. And that's why independent oversight of Indigenous peoples, prison justice activists, human rights activists need to be part of that independent oversight. And it has lacked independent oversight for far too long, and that's why this has been allowed to happen. And it looks like right now, things will only get worse unless we do something to force their hand. And I'm so glad you're having this session, because we need to force their hand. We're stuck here in our homes, but imagine our sisters on the inside being stuck in prisons where guards are taking their soap, or guards are taunting them, or they're not being able to have access to their own lawyers or visitors. Imagine not being able to see your children, how absolutely devastating that would be to people. We have an obligation to make sure that their human rights are respected, whether they're categorized as low risk or improperly categorized in higher levels.
Mm-hmm. You're right, they are terrified. We get calls all the time. Women are very, very afraid. you know, and if you go into any of the max unit of any of the women's prisons, you will see that it's mostly Indigenous women there. And in some of them, it's all Indigenous women in the max units. So, you know, I think any decarceration plan does need to include the community, and that hasn't happened. They told us at the beginning, when we started calling for the depopulation of prisons, that in fact, women were safer in prison. So we know that that's not true, and we're seeing that now. So, you know, that's why I say we're playing catch up. Over to you, Yusuf.
Thank you so much, Pam, for your response. I'd just like to add a couple of things with respect to your response. You mentioned one theme before I get to my question about the elusive term that we call human rights oversight, something that should be so effectively simple to attain. It's quite elusive within the prison justice system. The lack of independent oversight. I mean, this is not it's not a complicated conversation. It's very simple. Independent oversight in the correctional system. And we've had, it's been very elusive. So I appreciate you bringing that up. And I also want to bring up one part. You talk about, you know, the Indigenous women that are in prison, you know, right now and like suffering with COVID-19. Now let's add one more layer to this, is the layer of mental health, right? Indigenous women, you have mental health. You know, now if you don't see your family, for many people, that's life and death. If you don't see that lawyer or that phone call that you want to make, that's literally your connection to the outside world. So, and like, I didn't want to get too much away from your question, but I wanted to, like, you know, for the audience to remember too, like, it's one thing to be like an Indigenous woman being in prison. Now, being Indigenous women suffering from mental illness, that's the other extra layer too that is not often talked about as well, right? And that we need to talk about, and not having independent oversight, you know, it's like almost like a carton blanche where, like, you know, there's so much human rights abuses without that accountability. So thank you for that, you know, Pam, for mentioning that. And so related to that comment, you know, my next question is, in response to the risk you've identified for Indigenous women and girls in connection with COVID-19, you've called for the urgent development of a pandemic plan through a gendered lens, and even provided an initial framework of what such a plan needs to include. Will you walk us through your recommendations?
Yeah, sure. And, you know, thanks for all of those comments, because they're always, for Indigenous women, we have multiple layers of what's happening for people who are in prison and the many traumas that they've survived even before they got to prison. But in Canadian Dimension magazine, some time ago, I wrote an article outlining very briefly, just to kind of give, you know, the government a little push. You know, here's an idea of some of the things that you should be putting in your, you know, pandemic plan. It was boggling my mind that I would even have to write such an article. I mean, when you think about the amount of money that goes into national security and public safety and pipelines and everything else, that they don't have some kind of plan for prisons. And so I thought, I'm going to just hit some of the core issues that represent a gendered lens, because the one size fits all always disadvantages women, but one size fits all further disadvantages Indigenous women who have very unique and particular circumstances. So the first thing I said was, we need an urgent decarceration plan. I mean, that was literally on the top of the list. If you think about any institutions which are going to have the COVID pandemic spread fastest, it's going to be in an institutional setting. So look at, you know, elderly care homes. That's no surprise. Look at prisons, the prison outbreaks. That should be no surprise. So I thought, we need to do that, but not just decarcerate, not just open the doors and let people fend for themselves, but post-decarceration supports. And for women, that's particularly important. And so most of my recommendations about how do we provide these supports during the pandemic, but for Indigenous women post incarceration, those kinds of supports. So critical urgent funding for child welfare agencies, First Nation communities, Indigenous women organizations, anyone who supports or works with kids who are Indigenous kids who are currently in foster care. Because a woman coming out of prison, we're going to want to prioritize reunification with the family. And we know that the foster care system will not allow that to happen unless they have adequate and safe housing, unless they have food on the table, unless they have a place for their kids. And depending on how long they've been in prison, like, it's not like you're just going to walk out of prison and be able to walk into that. Some people maybe, but many would not be in that position, or to be able to get a job depending on what their convictions were. So definitely emergency funding for kids in care and to maintain those relationships. Also critical infrastructure. So not just funding, but the infrastructure to increase the amount of places where we can shelter Indigenous women from domestic abuse, from human trafficking, where we can shelter people in rape crisis centers, and not just overcrowding the little tiny centers and the very few that we have now, but massively expanding them in a different way. So not just a shelter, but we need urgent emergency kinds of housing for people too. So imagine you get out of prison, imagine getting out of Joliet, and they say, okay, you're going to be released. Well, that person's going to have to be isolated. Where do you safely isolate them? So we're going to need places where we can isolate people, make sure they have access to health care, mental health care during that isolation period, and then all of the reunification supports. And it's not just as easy as saying, here, go back to your community. First, there has to be a place in that community. Maybe they live in an urban area, but whether they live in an urban area or in a community, there needs to be resources for both of those places to be able to welcome these people back with the appropriate supports. It's no good to say, go back to your community and there's no house there and there's no place for you and your kids to live. And you know, it would take 8 weeks for you to get on the, you know, social assistance roles. Like, I mean, we really have to think out all of the day-to-day challenges our sisters inside might have, or women in general. And one of the other things I mentioned was we should have already expedited the registration for First Nations women under the Indian Act for Indian registration, because that is the way that they access critical federal programs and services, especially uninsured health care and things like Jordan's Principle. But that wasn't done pre-pandemic. If there was ever a time to expedite registration under Bill S3, it's now, because there's still tens of thousands of people who are otherwise entitled to Indian registration, including their children and grandchildren, who have not yet been registered. And in a pandemic, that's when you need it. When you think about the fact that people don't have their jobs, they don't have access to their potentially their employment insurance, health insurance, why aren't they doing this? And that's the direct responsibility of the federal government. And then things like a basic income or a livable income, or whatever the word or concept is being used, that's specific and targeted for Indigenous women. Again, not a one-size-fits-all, because a single individual male living in downtown Toronto has very different needs than an Indigenous woman living in a remote community with 6 kids with significant health care or mental health care needs and issues. You know, so we really have to think about all the ways in which we make it very individual, make it very focused on the needs of Indigenous women. And of course, emergency support payments for Indigenous women who right now can't afford to take care of their children, take care of their families. We're often taking care of our elderly parents, our aunts and uncles. Like many Indigenous peoples, we live in huge extended families, well beyond just the grandparent level. You know, we act as de facto foster parents to our cousins, our nephews, you name it. And we have to make sure that all of the current policies aren't excluding us, and in many cases they are. And then, you know, people might not think it's related, but if you think about man camps and all of the extractive industry that's been allowed to continue, there should be an immediate moratorium and halt to all man camps on Indigenous territories, because they are one of the main reasons why there's increased rates of violence and murder and missing around extractive industry areas, let alone the fact that they're destroying Indigenous territory without consent. But imagine for sisters on the inside, they don't even get a voice in any of that. So the last thing we need to do is get our sisters outside and then have them exposed to the violence that's created by the man camps sitting right beside their communities. So I think, you know, family and community-based supports and resources must come with individual supports and resources for the women and their kids.
Thank you so much. It can clearly be seen that these recommendations are tempered through not just through your personal conviction, but also through empathy and compassion and cultural competency. So thank you, Pam, for educating us. For many of us, that has to be involved in this conversation, even as ones that are not directly involved, but have a role as, you know, citizens in this country. So we really appreciate that, because you included many things, like you said, and it's not one size all. There's cultural competency, there's empathy, there's compassion, you know, there's the funding part, right? And I think all that is was there. So thank you. I'm going to pass it on to my wonderful colleague, Emily, to take us to the last question of the evening.
I mean, I just took, you know, reams of notes, and I appreciate all of the perspective you brought, and I will be utilizing a lot of these suggestions in our advocacy work moving forward. So thank you for that. I've been very excited to have this conversation with you for this very reason. So in the last question, we wanted to open it up a little bit and make it broader. And in a recent piece, you wrote that one of the first casualties of the COVID-19 pandemic would be Indigenous rights. And how are you right now seeing this prediction materialize, and what must be done to halt and reverse it?
Well, I'm really thankful for this question, because it's very scary, and it is literally happening right before our eyes. First of all, we know that Indigenous women and girls are already having their rights violated on a daily basis from ongoing genocide and all of Canada's laws and policies. I mean, that's a stated fact. We know that from the National Inquiry, and that's all been forgotten in this pandemic. So their rights continue to be violated. Every day on social media, we see another girl who's gone missing, another woman who's gone murdered, another woman who's been exploited, and nothing's being done about it. Secondly, we know that those in prison have had their basic human rights violated already, when we hear about guards taunting them, stealing their soap or cleaning supplies, or putting them in just general lockdown, as if that's the one-size-fits-all answer to the pandemic, or preventing communication with their lawyers or their families. I mean, regardless of the situation of the pandemic, there are still basic human rights. And the United Nations and numerous human rights treaty bodies have already called on states around the world to say, you may have people in carceral institutions, but you are still legally obligated to respect their human rights and to impact those as minimally as possible during this process. And I would argue that's not happening. And the reason why that's not happening is because they didn't have a plan. They didn't work with outside people to have a plan. And when you don't have a plan, you knee-jerk react, and the knee-jerk reaction is, well, for their own safety, we'll just put them all in lockdown, essentially all in solitary confinement, when we know that that's a form of torture. Exactly. And then thirdly, and you know, something that's just been devastating me is that while all of this is happening, you know, our sisters inside also know that they are locked up in prison with no way of advocating on the outside, with very little ways to get their voices heard, except through limited contact with advocates right now. And they know that federal and provincial governments and transnational corporations are violating their Aboriginal rights, their treaty rights, and their land rights, because even though they're incarcerated in prison right now, that doesn't mean that they still don't have these constitutionally and internationally protected rights that are being violated on the outside. But because they're incarcerated, they're absolutely prohibited from doing anything about that. That alone would be enough trauma to eat you up on the inside. And so you've got a situation where now, as predicted, you've got provinces like Alberta and Ontario who are saying, oh, don't worry, mining company or pipeline company, you don't have to abide completely by the environmental rules during the COVID pandemic, much like Donald Trump in the US told their companies, you know, it would be undue hardship for you to have to comply with COVID, so just keep about your business. We're all locked up in our houses, but there is exemptions for mining companies and pipeline companies and fracking companies and the entire extractive industry. And of course, they're getting outbreaks and they risk spreading that to the other communities. So It's not like sisters on the inside don't know that's happening, but they're just prohibited from having a say in it. And if you think about it, you know, our sisters are on the inside knowing that all of this is happening on their territory and they're prohibited from doing anything about it. And it means that we've come full circle, because Canada's entire objective has always been to remove us from our territories to get all of our lands and resources. I mean, it's called clearing the plains, it's called getting rid of the Indian problem, and their primary method of doing that, aside from forced sterilizations and scalpings and, you know, premature deaths, has been through institutionalization. Think about what the laws were under the Indian Act that prevented us from leaving our reserve. We were literally instituted on small acres of reserve land that was policed by the Northwest Mounted Police or the RCMP in later days, and we couldn't even leave to provide food for our families. Then they steal our children and institutionalize them in residential schools, were physically, sexually abused, tortured, medically experimented on, and thousands died. And you move from that process to the 60s scoop, where many kids were housed in adoption agencies and group homes, again, a form of institutionalization. And from there, you keep moving forward. There's Indian hospitals, there's mental health institutions, and now there's prisons. At every stage of the game, we're being institutionalized, and in doing that, removing us from our lands and taking away our ability to defend ourselves. So what good is a Section 35 constitutional right if we're wasting away in prison and not able to defend ourselves? And what needs to happen right now is to get our Indigenous women out of prison, reunited and supported with their families, whatever supports they need, because we need them as warriors on the front lines. We need them to help us defend our territories and to stop all of this climate change that'll literally be the end of us all. And our sisters on the inside know this, and we need them to come out. We need them as warriors. So hopefully this will be a call to action for everyone, CAEFS and senators and lawyers and MPs and human rights organizations, everybody to come together and demand that human rights organizations have an oversight over what's happening in prisons and with all of the pandemic measures, and get our people out.
Well, I certainly feel that call to action, and I think everybody who watches this will feel it as well, because I think it's clear. It's very clear. And so I think, you know, some of the ways that we've been doing advocacy over the last 6 weeks needs to pivot a little bit. And so I thank you for your perspective on that. It's been a real eye-opener, actually.
Thank you.
Just, you know, Dr. Pamela Palmater, I just would like to just say a sincere thank you. For me personally, it's been, you know, an educational opportunity, but also something where it's where I've learned a lot in this situation. So thank you.
Thank you so much for your time, Pam. And we will be posting this link on our Facebook pages right away. So please share.
Thank you so much.
Okay, goodbye.
Very much.
Bye.